everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining Carbon Pricing as Rent. And it's a discussion between an economist and a journalist. This conversation has been pre-recorded, so we can all sit back and watch a video. So there will not be time for questions at the end. Yeah, there's a contact for Judy in the chat.
Kay Boyce
and now I'm going to share my screen and we can watch this incredible, deep conversation. Sit back.
Author, economist, and James Kay Boyce is an author, economist, and emeritus professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he's also a senior fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute. His most recent books are The Case for Carbon Dividends and Economics for People and the Planet, Inequality in the Era of Climate Change, both published in 2019. Dr. Boyce earned his BA at Yale University and a PhD in economics from Oxford University. His research is published frequently in scholarly journals, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Ecological Economics, Environmental Research Letters, and Climatic Change. His work focuses on the political economy of climate change, environmental justice, and the framing of climate policy in the United States. Welcome, Dr. Boyce. Could you start by telling us how you became interested in the concept of carbon dividends?
Sure. It was about 20 years ago. I was organizing a project called the Natural Assets Project, which was a collaborative research and education initiative funded by the Ford Foundation. And the aim of the project was to explore ways that the two goals of protecting the environment and reducing poverty, asset poverty in particular, could be combined. And of course, these are often juxtaposed as contradictory, that somehow protecting the environment means you don't do as much to reduce poverty and vice versa. And our idea was to look at the complementarities between the two. And in particular, look at the ways in which protecting the environment could go hand in hand with building wealth or building assets in the hands of low-income individuals and communities, including what we called natural assets. So in the course of that project, one of the collaborators who I met for the first time then, and subsequently became a good friend of mine, was Peter Barnes. Peter was working on a book, which ultimately was published soon thereafter, called Who Owns the Sky? And he was putting out the idea at that point of what he called the Sky Trust, which was really an early incarnation of carbon dividends. The idea being that we should limit the use of the carbon sink, the atmosphere and biosphere as a place to discharge of carbon, to a safe level, and that putting such limits on would mean rationing its use and therefore making it more costly, and that the money generated in that process should be recycled to the people as equal per capita payments, what we now call carbon dividends. So that struck me as a really interesting idea, and I started working on it then and have continued making that a significant part of my research agenda ever since.
So, and you've suggested that the dividend is crucial to the success of a carbon pricing scheme. Why is that?
Well, when we limit the amount of carbon coming into the economy and thereby raise its price, the extra money that consumers pay doesn't disappear. It has to go somewhere. And I think it's very important for the fairness and the political durability of the policy to think about where that money should go. The political sensitivity of raising prices of fossil fuels is very clear. We saw it graphically demonstrated in the Yellow Vest movement in France, when protesters would say, you know, President Macron worries about the end of the world, but we worry about the end of the month. And it's true that a lot of people worry about the end of the month, and they have very good reasons for doing so. So we have to recognize that if we're going to limit the amount of fossil fuels we're using. And if that's going to increase prices that are going to hit working families, we need to think about where the money goes and how it can be distributed in a way that's fair and keeps those families whole, protects them from economic harm, even as we protect the environment. And so in terms of where the money goes, broadly speaking, there are three options. One is that you can give the money to fossil fuel corporations. Now, this may seem like a rather silly idea, but in fact, that's what cap and trade, or rather cap and giveaway and trade programs in their purest form would do. They'd give away permits to bring carbon into the economy, and the prices would go up, and the recipients of the permits would keep the money. So that's one option, not a very attractive one from the standpoint of anyone other than the corporations. A second option is that the money could go to the government. The permits could be sold at auction, or equivalently, there could be a carbon tax, and the revenue could be retained by the government for a variety of purposes, good, bad, or indifferent, depending upon one's point of view. And the third possibility is that the money could go back to the people, based on the principle that the people are the rightful owners of the limited carbon space, of the atmosphere and the biosphere, and that as the owners, they're the ones who should be receiving the money. And that is what we now call carbon dividends. And in terms of protecting the policy from the public backlash that would otherwise be likely to result from higher fossil fuel prices, it seems to me that the carbon dividend option has a great deal to recommend it. It's extremely fair in that everybody gets the same amount of money, no matter who they are, no matter where they live, as equal co-owners of the limited carbon absorptive capacity of the sky and the planet. And it's very transparent in that the money comes back in a way that they can see very clearly. I think it's important that the money come back through a dedicated delivery mechanism, the proverbial check in the mail, although in most cases this would of course be done electronically through transfers into accounts, but as a segregated stream of money, not, for example, buried in the tax code or somewhere else where it's difficult to see the money coming back, so that when people see prices going up at the gas pump or in their electricity bills, they can see equally well the money coming back to them and realize that they're getting their fair share. And for everybody who's using less than average amounts of fossil fuels, which is in fact the majority of people use less than the average, since the average is bumped up by the really big users at the high end of the income spectrum, the proverbial 1%, for the majority who are modest users of fossil fuels or even small users, they come out ahead. And it's a calculation that will be clear and easy for them to make. And so rather than looking at the fossil fuel price increases as yet another burden imposed upon them, they will look at those price increases as something that's actually going straight into their pockets and improving their incomes and quality of life rather than the reverse. So that's why I think it's important, Judy. I think it's important from an ethical standpoint, but it's also important from a political standpoint. It's important in order to lock in durable public support for a policy that, of course, isn't just a matter of passing a law and you've solved the problem. This law has to stay in place. The policy has to stay in place for the decades needed to complete the clean energy transition. It has to be as durable as the support for Social Security or Medicare have been, for example. And I think carbon dividends are the best way to ensure that kind of durable support.
Thank you. I do want to ask a couple more questions about the dividend, but first, I'd like to ask you to talk about the carbon price. In the case for carbon dividends, you write about two different ways to determine where to set a carbon price. The efficiency approach based on cost-benefit analysis, and the target-based approach, which focuses on science and safety. Can you talk about the difference between the two and which one you favor?
Sure. So the efficiency approach is the approach that appeals to many economists. And although I'm trained as an economist and taught economics for many decades, I don't think it's the right approach to deal with this particular problem. I think the better approach is the one favored by most scientists, which is what I call a safety-based approach. So the way the efficiency approach works is to use the tool of cost-benefit analysis to decide upon what's the right price of carbon and what's the right level of emissions. There's several problems in making such a calculation. Problems that, in my view, are really insuperable. On the cost side, no one really knows what the relationship is or will be down the road in terms of the effect of price increases on quantity reductions, or the effect, conversely, of quantity reductions through caps on carbon emissions on fuel prices. There are just too many imponderables. It depends on whether the economy is in a boom or a bust. It depends on the pace of technological change and energy efficiency and renewables, a host of variables. So we really don't even know that. On the benefit side, it's even more difficult, because to translate the benefits of curbing carbon emissions and reducing climate change into dollar and cents terms, you need to put dollar and cents values on a host of effects that are both hard to measure in monetary terms, like saving biodiversity or preventing loss of life, and also involve a lot of unknowns in terms of what the impacts, the damages will be. Moreover, since those damages stream out into the future, you need to convert those into present value terms by means of what's called a discount rate, which is kind of like an interest rate in reverse. And depending on whether you use a high or low discount rate, which is a very contentious matter, you can get wildly different results. So for folks who aren't familiar with the way this works, if you want to see a nice description of it, look at the work of William Nordhaus, the Nobel Prize winning economist, who wrote a piece a couple years ago for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where he in effect compares these two approaches. And he himself is, as an economist, is a proponent of the efficiency approach, and he has a trajectory of emissions and carbon prices, and he compares that to what you might call a safety-based approach, in his case a rather modest one, which is designed to limit carbon emissions to a level that would result in a 2.5 degree centigrade increase in global mean surface temperatures above the pre-industrial level. And even with that relatively modest notion of safety, there's a huge difference in the quantity trajectories and price trajectories that emerge from these two perspectives. The so-called efficiency objective, the one that, again, most economists preserve, would result in much lower carbon prices and much more emissions. In Nordhaus's preferred trajectory, by the turn of the century, by 2100, he would expect a 3.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures above the pre-industrial level, and further rises beyond that. Now, these are temperature increases that most scientists think would be absolutely catastrophic. And yet, in the logic of cost-benefit analysis, using the assumptions and parameters that he uses in his models, which are pretty mainstream, that's considered efficient. That's the efficient thing to do. My view is that we should adopt a science-based target. For example, 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and then simply calculate on that basis what kind of emissions trajectory is consistent with achieving that target, impose that as a constraint on the amount of carbon we allow into our economy, and similarly in other economies in the world doing the same thing, and ratchet down our use of carbon accordingly, and let the price rise as much as it rises as a result, which will again depend on boom versus bust cycles, the pace of technological change, what other public policies are adopted in terms of public investment regulation, etc. But that's a way that it seems to me we can achieve the emissions reductions that scientists are telling we need to achieve in order to prevent some truly horrific scenarios from playing out for future generations.
Thank you. So returning to the dividend, you've written about two fairly innovative concepts, carbon rent and universal property. If I understand it, the dividend can be thought of as rent paid for the use of a scarce resource, in this case, the capacity of the environment to absorb carbon dioxide. And that resource is owned in common by all the members of a society. Can you explain that or correct me?
Yes, you're right. That's exactly how I view this. The carbon rent, in other words, is the extra money that consumers of fossil fuels pay as a result of limiting our use of fossil fuels to respect the limits imposed by nature, the limits that we understand from climate science. So as we constrain our use of fossil fuels to stay within those limits, instead of viewing the limited carbon absorptive capacity of the environment as a free resource that's unlimited and can be used and abused at no cost, it becomes costly to do so. And as I mentioned before, the question then becomes where the money goes. But that money is the carbon rent. And I argue that the carbon rent and the asset that underlies it, the ability of the environment to safely absorb and recycle carbon emissions, should be treated as something that belongs in equal and common measure to everybody. And I call this universal property. And the reason I use that term universal property is to distinguish it from the more familiar sorts of property in our society today, which are on the one hand state property, which is described as public property, but that really means property of the government, and private property. So universal property, as I'm using the term, is different from state or public property in that it doesn't belong to the government. The revenue that is generated from use of this universal property doesn't flow into the coffers of the state. It flows back to the people directly as its rightful owners. And it's different from private property in that the owners are, first of all, individuals, not corporations, for example. Second, the property rights are inalienable. They can't be bought or sold. They're not, it's not turning the atmosphere into a commodity. And thirdly, it's perfectly egalitarian. So every individual owns the same amount of this property. So in all three of those respects, the individuals, the inalienability, and the egalitarian nature of it, universal property is distinct from private property as we know it in our society. So it seems to me this is an important alternative type of property which could and should be the foundation for how we address the question of how to allocate carbon rent. I should add one thing perhaps, which is that the closest real world example to universal property that I know of here in the US is the Alaska Permanent Fund, which treats the oil reserves of Alaska as belonging in common and equal measure to all Alaskans in present and future generations, and puts royalties from oil extraction into a fund that's used to pay out an annual dividend. Anyone who's not familiar with this, if you go to the website of the Alaska Permanent Fund, you can see how it works. And you can also see the short 1 or 2 page PDF form that Alaskans use to sign up for their dividend. It's not difficult to achieve this administratively. The Alaska Permanent Fund, I think, is a very valuable example for showing that this kind of property is a practical possibility, not just a hypothetical idea. Of course, there's one big difference between the Alaska Permanent Fund and carbon dividends, and that is that the Alaska Permanent Fund, the money comes from extracting oil. So the more you extract, the bigger the dividends, perhaps giving some people in Alaska an incentive to want to extract more. Whereas carbon dividends come from limiting our use of carbon. And indeed, the more tightly you limit it, the larger the dividends are likely to be, because the price would rise even more steeply as you ratchet down emissions further.
So it seems like this theory of property rights would appeal to people on the progressive side of the political spectrum. Is there any feature of the dividend that might appeal to conservatives, particularly conservatives in Congress?
Yes, I certainly think so. And there's evidence that it already does in terms of some outspoken conservative voices, including former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of the Treasury James Baker, who've advocated carbon dividends as a way to address the problem of climate change. I think in terms of how this appeals to conservatives, I can think of four ways, all of which are important. First, of course, is that conserving the environment and the planet for the well-being of future generations is in certain ways the essence of being conservative. It means conserving what you've got rather than risking it all in reckless gambles. Secondly, carbon dividends bypass one of the key axes of contention between conservatives and liberals in this country, which is over the appropriate size of the state. With the revenues flowing back to the public, it doesn't make the government bigger or make the government smaller. It parks that debate on the side and yet addresses the problem of climate change. So by circumventing that argument over whether the government should get bigger or smaller, I think you open the door to bipartisan support for a policy like this. Thirdly, conservatives generally are against people getting something for nothing. They're against subsidies. And a grotesque subsidy is the use of the limited ability of the environment to absorb carbon and other wastes as a sink into which we can toss these things and not to have to pay for it as you go. So I think you can describe limiting carbon emissions and thereby putting a price on carbon as ending a pollution subsidy, which should be anathema, I would think, to real conservatives. I think there's a fourth reason as well. In the book, I describe universal property as, I say, if you have to put a new idea in an old label, maybe call it libertarian socialism. And although libertarianism and socialism are often juxtaposed as very different, in fact, they both have an egalitarian core in common, which is the idea of equal distribution of rights in the case of libertarianism and equal distribution of wealth in the case of socialism. And I think the libertarian aspect of this policy is in its respect for the rights of the individuals as the individuals to whom the carbon revenue should flow. And the socialist aspect, of course, is the commitment to equality. And I think real conservatives can get behind carbon dividends for all of these reasons.
I know you share the concern of the environmental justice community about the risk that carbon pricing can result in what are referred to as hotspots, when emissions are abated last in communities that have been historically disadvantaged. What policy measures can be used to address this concern?
Well, I think it's important to realize that hotspots already exist. It's well documented that exposure to pollution, including co-pollutants from the burning of fossil fuels, is quite unequally distributed across the country and often concentrated in low-income communities, in communities with high percentages of people of color. So there is a serious environmental justice dimension to the fossil fuel problem. And the risk in a carbon policy that's not paying attention to that dimension is not only that it will fail to achieve emissions reductions in the places where they can do the most good in terms of public health and in terms of reducing environmental disparities, but that indeed, perversely, it could exacerbate the problem by resulting in emissions increases in some vulnerable communities. For example, if you replace coal with natural gas, it's quite possible that some of those natural gas plants will be located closer to urban centers and in communities that have high percentages of low-income people and people of color, meaning that for them, the pollution to which they're exposed actually gets worse. So it seems to me that that's not a fanciful risk. In fact, there's evidence from California, which has been, as you know, one of the leading states in seeking to curb emissions, that has in fact happened. There was a very interesting article about a year ago in the journal PLOS Medicine by Laura Cushing and co-authors, which presented early evidence from California showing that in a number of communities, emissions had gone up, and those communities tended to be communities with high proportions of people of color, lower income, etc. So this is a real issue, and it seems to me it needs to be taken on board as part of the agenda to ensure that our climate policies are just and command widespread public support by virtue of that justice. So how does one incorporate that? Well, one straightforward way to do so is to include some regulatory measures in addition to the overall limit on carbon and the price that results from that, that specify that in pollution sources of particular concern, locations, plants, sectors, emissions reductions have to be at least as large as those which are set by the overall trajectory for the nation, and ensure that these communities will at least benefit proportionally, ideally even more than proportionally. You would want to get disproportionate reductions in the places where the air quality, public health, and environmental justice impacts are most severe. But minimally, I think you should have regulations in place to ensure that they get reductions commensurate with those of the target as a whole. In addition, from the standpoint of justice, I think it's important to recognize that there are also environmental justice issues for communities that have been impacted by fossil fuel extraction, which include a number of rural communities. Think about the communities in Appalachia impacted by mountaintop removal, for example. And it seems to me, again, that part of a overall climate policy portfolio should be measures that ensure that the environmental devastation that's been visited on these communities is repaired through ecological restoration investments. Similarly, I think workers in the fossil fuel industry, their interests should not be sacrificed in the pursuit of this policy. We ought to have what are called just transition policies to ensure that they don't suffer as a result of this either. After all, they've done a lot to contribute to our energy security over the years, and it would be a disgrace, really, to treat them as collateral damage as we move to protect the environment. So in all these dimensions, in terms of pollution hotspots, in terms of the ravages of fossil fuel extraction, in terms of justice for workers in the fossil fuel sector, we need to incorporate a number of complementary policies along with carbon dividends. We need investment. including public investment. We need smart regulations. I'm not saying all regulations are smart, but we need smart ones like regulations to prevent the exacerbation of hotspots and ensure commensurate reductions in vulnerable communities. And we need carbon dividends. We need to walk on, I was going to say walk on two legs, but really I've just mentioned three legs now, the dividends, the investment, and the regulation. All of those are important. They're not mutually exclusive. There's no need to say, I've got the right one and others don't matter. They all matter. And I think they all can and should be part of a comprehensive and fair climate policy.
Dr. Boyce, thank you so much for making the case for carbon pricing and especially for carbon dividends.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Once again, Dr. James Boyce is the author most recently of The Case for Carbon Dividends and Economics for People and the Planet, Inequality in the Era of Climate Change. To learn more about his work, you can visit his website, jameskboyce.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.